On the eve of his hanging, when the town of Dry Creek had finally gone quiet and even the saloon lamps had been turned low, Elias Crow sat alone beneath the unfinished gallows, his boots resting on hard-packed earth and his wrists free only because the law believed there was no place left for him to run, and as the wind slid through the beams above like a careful whisper it stirred the rope so that it creaked softly, not like a threat but like a reminder, and Elias breathed in the smell of dust. Old wood, and distant sage as though he meant to carry it with him wherever he was going next, for this was the last night the world would belong to him, the last night he would hear crickets argue with the dark or feel the slow ache in his bones that came from too many years riding hard and sleeping rough, and he spoke then not to the sheriff who had granted him this strange mercy, nor to the stars watching with their cold patience, but to the empty space before him, as if someone unseen had finally come to listen, and he began by saying his name aloud, tasting it like a truth he had not owned in a long while, and he said that the stories told about him were easier than the truth, that it was simpler for people to believe he had been born cruel, sharp as a blade from the start, than to imagine a man shaped slowly by hunger, loss, and one soft moment he never learned how to protect, and as the rope swayed again he closed his eyes and confessed that before the blood and the bounty posters and the songs whispered in fear, there had been a boy who loved quiet mornings and a woman who believed he could be gentle, a woman whose name he had never spoken after the night the world broke, because names had power and he had spent his life trying not to feel hers, and he admitted that every robbery, every gun raised, every lie told to survive had been built around that silence, around the choice he made when he walked away instead of staying, when he believed distance would keep her safe and discovered too late that absence could wound just as deeply, and he said that the legend painted him as a man who took lives without thought, but the truth was that each loss had marked him, not with pride but with a growing weight that bent his back and hollowed his chest, that he remembered faces and voices and final looks, and that the worst part of dying tomorrow was not the fear of the drop or the end of breath but the knowledge that history would not care to hear the quieter parts, the parts where he had turned his horse away from towns at dawn because the memory of her smile rose unbidden, where he had given stolen money to strangers and ridden on before thanks could be spoken, where he had stood outside a church once and listened to a hymn because it reminded him of evenings long gone, and as he spoke the night seemed to lean closer, the gallows casting a long shadow that felt almost like company, and he confessed that the secret he carried was not about innocence or guilt in the way the law measured such things, but about love, about the moment he realized he was capable of it and the fear that followed, because loving her had shown him the man he might have been and losing her had convinced him that man was already dead, and he told the empty air that the crime which sealed his fate, the one the town remembered as the cruelest, had been born from a choice meant to save a child who reminded him too much of himself, that he had stepped into the open to draw danger away knowing the law would come down hard, and that he had accepted the name monster because monsters were easier to hunt than broken men, and as the wind picked up and the rope knocked once more against the beam he felt the hours thinning, stretching toward dawn, and he wondered if somewhere far from Dry Creek a woman might pause for no clear reason, feeling a heaviness she could not name, and he said softly that if she ever heard the truth he hoped she would understand. That everything he became had been shaped by loving her once and failing to be brave enough to stay, and when his voice finally quieted and the confession settled into the night like dust after hooves, Elias Crow sat very still beneath the gallows, having given the darkness the one thing it had never taken from him willingly, the truth, and in that fragile, trembling silence, with morning still hours away, the blood-soaked legend of the Wild West began to crack, though no one yet knew what would be revealed when the sun rose. The first thing the town of Red Mesa noticed was the way the heat seemed to hold its breath when she arrived, as though the desert itself recognized her and chose silence out of respect or fear, and she rode in alone at mid-morning with a black veil drawn back from her face, revealing eyes the color of storm-worn stone and a calm that unsettled men who had faced gunfire without flinching, for her name, Maeve Calder, had reached Red Mesa long before her horse's hoofs did, carried by whispers that clung to saloon walls and campfires alike, whispers that said every outlaw who had ever loved her met a violent end, that she was not cruel but cursed, not heartless but followed by death like a patient shadow, and she did nothing to deny it as she dismounted near the edge of town, only tied her horse with steady hands and walked toward the small adobe house she had purchased sight unseen, a house baked pale by the sun and standing slightly apart from the others, as if it too understood the value of distance, and the townsfolk watched from doorways and windows, some crossing themselves, others pretending not to look at all, because fear in Red Mesa had learned how to dress itself as indifference, and Maeve felt it settle around her shoulders as naturally as dust, familiar and unwelcome but not surprising, for she had lived with it for years, since the first man who loved her had died with her name on his lips and the second had sworn he would escape the same fate only to fall beneath a stranger's bullet. And after the third she stopped counting, stopped believing love could arrive without a grave waiting close behind, and so she came to Red Mesa not seeking connection but quiet, a place where the days would be shaped by sun and work and nights would pass without memories knocking too loudly, and for a time it seemed she might succeed, because weeks went by with nothing more dramatic than the wind rattling the shutters or the groan of old wood settling after sunset, and Maeve tended her small garden, drew water, and kept her gaze level and her words polite but brief, giving the town no reason to grow curious beyond what fear had already planted, yet fate, which had never respected her boundaries, was already moving toward her across the desert on unsteady legs, and it came one afternoon when the heat pressed down so heavily that even the lizards sought shade, when Maeve heard a sound at her door that did not belong to the wind or the house itself, a dull, uneven thud followed by a breath that scraped like it had traveled too far without rest, and when she opened the door she found a man collapsed against the frame, blood darkening his shirt, his hat fallen somewhere behind him in the dust, his face drawn tight not with fear but with the effort of staying conscious, and for a single suspended moment Maeve considered closing the door, not out of cruelty but out of a learned instinct for survival, because she recognized the look of him at once, the look of a gunslinger shaped by long roads and longer regrets, a man whose life had been lived in the space between violence and escape, and she knew what the town would say if she took him in, knew how quickly whispers could turn into certainty, but something in his eyes stopped her, not charm or desperation, but a quiet apology, as if he already regretted the trouble he was bringing to her doorstep, and so she pulled him inside, bolted the door, and laid him out on the narrow bed with movements that were practiced and careful, because tending wounds was something she had learned out of necessity, and as she worked she learned his name was Thomas Reed, spoken low and strained as if even words cost him strength, and she cleaned the wound, stitched where needed, and cooled his fever through the long night, listening to his breathing and the distant sounds of Red Mesa settling into darkness, aware with every passing hour that the town would notice his horse, the tracks, the absence of gunfire that usually followed such men, and that questions would come. But when dawn arrived and Thomas opened his eyes with the soft confusion of someone surprised to still be alive, something shifted between them that neither spoke aloud, a fragile understanding born not of romance but of shared weariness, of two souls who had seen enough of the world to know how easily it could turn sharp, and in the days that followed as Thomas healed slowly under Maeve's roof, he learned her reputation without her ever naming it, sensed it in the careful way townsmen avoided the house, in the looks that lingered too long before darting away, and one evening as the sun painted the desert red and gold he said quietly that he knew what people believed about her, and that he did not frighten easily, and Maeve told him then, her voice steady but her hands stilling in her lap, that courage had nothing to do with it, that death did not need fear to arrive, only proximity, and she warned him that staying would not end well, not for him, not for her, and Thomas listened without interrupting, without smiling or dismissing her words, and when she finished he said simply that he had spent most of his life running from one thing or another, and that he was tired, and the honesty of it settled between them like a shared breath, and from that point on something unspoken took root, not rushing toward passion but unfolding slowly through glances held a moment too long, through the comfort of shared meals eaten in easy silence, through the way Thomas fixed the broken fence without being asked and Maeve left a cup of water by his bed each night even after he no longer needed it, and Red Mesa watched from a distance as the wounded gunslinger grew stronger and did not leave, as laughter, soft, rare, but real, drifted once or twice from the widow's house, and unease crept through the town like a second heat, because stories had taught them how this ended, and they braced themselves for the moment violence would come calling, and it did, not with thunder but with inevitability, when a pair of men rode in asking questions about Thomas Reed, men whose eyes were sharp and whose patience was thin, men who recognized Maeve on sight and exchanged knowing looks, and though she denied seeing Thomas and though Thomas prepared quietly to leave that very night, fate tightened its grip, and a confrontation followed that ended with blood staining the dust at the edge of town, with Thomas wounded once more but alive, and the truth laid bare before the watching eyes of Red Mesa, and afterward as the sun dipped low and the danger passed, Thomas stood before Maeve knowing the pattern, knowing the cost of staying, and in his gaze was not accusation but sorrow, because love had found him when he least expected it and now demanded a choice, and Maeve felt her heart break not from loss but from hope, because for the first time in years she wanted him to stay, wanted to believe that the stories were wrong, that fate could be rewritten, but she had buried too many men to gamble again, And so beneath the burning western sky she told him goodbye before he could die for her name, and Thomas rode out at dawn with Red Messer watching in silence, leaving Maeve standing alone in the doorway as the dust settled and the desert reclaimed its stillness. And though the town would later say the curse had held true once more, they would never know the deeper tragedy, that for a brief and fragile moment beneath the unforgiving sun, love had lived quietly and honestly in the widow's house, and that sometimes the cruelest endings were the ones that spared life but broke the heart. Instead, Deadwood Crossing had forgotten the sound of law long before the man carrying it rode into town, and when he did, hunched slightly in the saddle with a coat too worn for pride and a star pinned to his chest like an old wound reopened, the place barely stirred, because Deadwood Crossing had learned to survive by pretending not to notice men who looked like trouble or hope, and Silas Boone looked like both, his horse moving slow from exhaustion rather than caution, his eyes scanning the street not with fear but with the tired awareness of someone who had once believed order could be carved from chaos and paid dearly for it. And as he dismounted near the empty marshal's office, its door hanging crooked on one hinge, memories came back uninvited, layered over the present like dust on old tracks, for this was not the first town he had tried to save and not the first badge he had worn, though it would be the last, and the townsfolk watched from behind curtains and barrels, measuring him against the stories they told themselves to sleep at night, stories where survival meant silence and courage was a young man's mistake. And Silas felt the weight of those stories as keenly as he felt the scar beneath his shirt, the one that marked the moment his past had split him in two, because years earlier in a place much like Deadwood Crossing he had been a marshal who believed in rules and second chances, who had trusted the wrong man and hesitated at the wrong time, and by the end of that day the jail was burned, the streets were stained, and his wife lay cold beneath a borrowed blanket while the men responsible rode free. And the badge he wore now was the same one he had torn from his coat and buried beneath a tree, only to dig it up again years later when running proved worse than remembering, and Deadwood Crossing, lawless and brittle, had been listed in the papers as a town beyond saving, a place the territory had written off like a bad debt, but something in Silas had turned his horse this way anyway, perhaps guilt, perhaps stubbornness, perhaps the quiet need to stand still long enough to face what followed him, and inside the marshal's office he found dust, broken furniture, and the echo of what had once been purpose, and he cleaned it slowly, methodically, as if restoring the room might restore something in himself, and word spread not through announcement but through observation, through the simple fact that the man with the badge did not leave, that he fixed the door, swept the floor, and posted no threats, and when a drunk fired a pistol into the air that night Silas disarmed him without violence and locked him in a cell whose bars still held despite the years, and something shifted then, subtle but real, because Deadwood Crossing had not seen restraint in a long time, and as days passed Silas learned the shape of the town's fear, learned the names of the men who ruled it from the shadows, learned that a gang calling itself the Rook Brotherhood collected taxes in blood and controlled the roads, and learned that the town was already preparing for what everyone believed was inevitable, a reckoning that would leave Deadwood Crossing emptier than before, and Silas listened more than he spoke, his presence steady but unassuming, and at night he sat alone with his thoughts, the ghosts of his failure walking the length of the room, his wife's voice the clearest among them, not accusing but disappointed, and he confessed to the silence that he had been afraid once, afraid to act too soon, afraid to become the kind of man who chose violence even when it was necessary, and that fear had cost him everything, and now, older and heavier with regret, he wondered if courage could arrive late and still matter, and the answer came not in words but in action. When the Rook Brotherhood rode into town in force, confident and loud, their leader a man named Calder Knox whose smile never reached his eyes, and he laughed openly at the sight of a lone marshal, mocked the badge, and told Silas to leave before sunset if he valued his life, and Silas felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the crossroads between restraint and resolve, and this time he did not hesitate, did not raise his voice or draw his gun, but spoke clearly and calmly, telling Knox that Deadwood Crossing would no longer kneel, and the silence that followed was heavier than gunfire, because everyone understood what had just been set in motion, and Knox rode out promising war, and the town turned its anxious gaze to Silas, some with hope, others with blame already prepared, and Silas did not promise victory or safety, only that he would stand. And he organized what little defense the town could offer, teaching men who had forgotten how to hold their ground, positioning women and children away from the main street, and as night fell before the expected attack, he walked the length of Deadwood Crossing alone, touching door frames, memorizing faces, knowing that by morning some of this would be gone, and when the Brotherhood returned at dawn, the air sharp with dust and tension, Silas stood in the open, his coat still, his badge catching. The light, and the fight that followed was hard and unforgiving, marked by noise and fear and moments where the past threatened to swallow him whole, moments where he saw his failure replaying itself, but each time he pushed forward, choosing action over doubt, and when the smoke cleared the Brotherhood lay broken, Calder Knox gone for good, and Deadwood Crossing stood wounded but alive, and Silas Boone remained standing, though the cost was written plainly in the way he leaned against the office wall afterward, breathing hard, eyes closed, the ghosts quieter now but not gone, and the town gathered around him not in celebration but in something deeper, recognition perhaps, that law was not a promise of peace but a willingness to stand when it mattered most, and Silas knew he would not stay forever, that his road would continue, but as he looked at the badge he once hated and now understood, he realized that while he could never undo the past, he had finally faced it, and in Deadwood Crossing, a place abandoned by hope, the last marshal had done the one thing he had failed to do before, he had stayed, and in doing so, he had given the town, and himself, a reason to believe that even broken men could still hold the line. Deep in Black Canyon, where the sun seemed to lose its warmth before it touched the canyon floor and shadows clung to the rock like old regrets, there lay a vein of gold spoken of only in low voices, a place men called the Devil's Gold not because they had seen the devil there but because those who went looking rarely returned the same, and when they did return they carried a look in their eyes that no amount of money could soften, and it was this story, worn thin by time yet stubbornly alive, that found its way to Nathaniel Pike on a night when hunger pressed harder than fear, for Nathaniel was a prospector shaped by loss and long roads, a man who had buried more dreams than he had ever uncovered, and when the map fell into his hands, tucked inside the false bottom of a poker table abandoned by a man who left town without saying goodbye, he felt not excitement but a slow, careful hope, the kind that came only after disappointment had taught him restraint, and the map was old, hand-drawn, its ink faded and edges soft as if it had been folded and unfolded by many hands before his, and scrawled in the margin were words that did not read like a warning so much as a plea, urging whoever found it to turn back while they still could, but Nathaniel had learned that desperation made its own language, and by dawn he was riding toward Black Canyon with his mule and what little water he could spare, telling himself that gold was just stone with promise until proven otherwise, yet as the canyon walls rose around him and the air grew unnaturally still, something shifted, subtle at first, like a change in pressure before a storm, and he began to hear it then, the whispers, not loud enough to be clear, not sharp enough to name, but present all the same, moving with the wind yet distinct from it, brushing against his thoughts rather than his ears, and they spoke not in commands but in suggestions, reminding him of debts unpaid, of nights spent staring at the dark wondering how life had narrowed to this single chance, and Nathaniel told himself it was exhaustion, the mind reaching for comfort or meaning where there was none, and he pressed on, following the map deeper into the canyon until the walls closed in and the light thinned to a pale ribbon overhead, and there he found signs others had been there before him, rusted tools, scraps of cloth, a boot heel half buried in gravel, each discovery tightening his chest because it told a story of effort without reward, of men who had come believing and left broken or not at all, and the whispers grew clearer as he descended, no longer content to murmur but beginning to speak in tones that felt familiar, borrowing voices from his past, his father's steady reassurance, a friend's laugh lost to time, even the soft encouragement of a woman he once loved and failed to follow when the road split them apart, and each voice promised the same thing in different words, that the gold was real, that it was close, that all he had to do was keep going, and when Nathaniel reached the narrow cleft marked on the map and saw the faint glimmer in the rock, a thread of yellow catching the weak light, his breath caught not in triumph but in awe, because the gold was there, undeniable and rich, running through the stone like a pulse, and the whispers swelled then, no longer pretending to be kind, urging him to dig, to claim what fate had denied him elsewhere, to take enough that he would never have to wander again, and Nathaniel worked with a fevered focus, striking stone and filling his satchel while the canyon seemed to lean closer, the walls echoing with more than the sound of his tools, and time lost its shape as he labored, until at last he sat back, exhausted and shaking, his pack heavy with gold, and in that moment the whispers changed, shedding their borrowed warmth and revealing something colder beneath, asking him what he was willing to give in return, and Nathaniel felt a pressure in his chest, a weight that was not physical but heavy all the same, and he understood then what the price was, not blood or life in the immediate sense, but something quieter and more lasting, a surrender of peace, of rest, of the ability to ever feel content with enough, and he thought of the men whose traces he had passed, of how greed did not always look Like hunger, but sometimes like hope stretched too thin, and for the first time since finding the map he felt fear settle properly into his bones, and he tried to leave, hoisting the pack and turning back toward the narrow path, but the canyon resisted, the air thickening, the whispers rising in anger now, accusing him of weakness, of ingratitude, of daring to take without paying, and his steps slowed, not because the path had changed but because doubt had taken hold, and in that suspended moment Nathaniel remembered something small and easily overlooked, a memory not sharpened by pain but softened by time, of sitting beside a fire with nothing in his pockets and feeling, briefly, that it was enough to simply be alive and not alone, and that memory steadied him in a way gold never could, and with a resolve born not of bravery but of weariness, he opened the pack and let the gold spill onto the canyon floor, watching it catch the dim light one last time before the whispers fell into a stunned silence, and then, slowly, the air loosened, the weight lifted, and the canyon seemed to exhale, and Nathaniel Pike walked away empty-handed but unburdened, emerging from Black Canyon at dusk with nothing to show for his journey except dust on his boots and a look in his eyes that suggested he had stood at the edge of something vast and chosen to step back, and when he reached the nearest town and spoke of the Devil's Gold, his story spread in the familiar way, twisted and sharpened until some said he had gone mad and others said he had been afraid to claim what was rightfully his, but a few listened closely and noticed what he did not say, that he never spoke of regret, and years later when another map surfaced and another desperate soul set out toward Black Canyon, the whispers rose again, patient and practiced, waiting to offer riches at a price, because the gold did not need to move to claim its due, it only needed men willing to listen, and somewhere far from the canyon Nathaniel Pike slept easily beneath open skies, having learned that some fortunes, once refused, lost their power forever.